miss you so very much.
Right now, on this, the anniversary of 9/11, we pay tribute to the fallen. And next,
if you can't beat Barack Obama with this record, then shut down the party.
the season of discontent for the GOP. Well, the voices on the right not too pleased with Romney are growing louder. We're going to break down what he's got to do with time running out to step up his game. And later,
others will say it's the president's job to figure out how to tear down that brick wall. In this case, he did not.
who is in charge in Washington? According to Bob Woodward's account, the answer would be nobody. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us this Tuesday evening, September 11th. We're going to get into that, plus a little reminder where this country was 4 years ago to the day. But first, we begin where this nation was 11 years ago to the day. This, the anniversary of 9/11, the tragedy, of course, that changed our country. Well, it was remembered more quietly, but no less passionately this year. Sam Liebman, she joins us live from Lower Manhattan with the very latest. Samantha?
Well, Richard, the pain still looms large despite a modest, smaller ceremony this year. But it all began with the towering tribute in lights that shines up from Lower Manhattan every year since the attacks. The lights were illuminated last night and extinguished at dawn. It's a tribute that will be repeated at 7-Eleven this evening, a fitting way to cap off a day of ceremonies, remembering those who died that tragic day. Across the nation, 9/11 commemorations were scaled back this year as the country tries to strike a balance between remembering and recovering from the terror attacks. This morning at Ground Zero, for the first time, only those who lost loved ones spoke. They read the names of the 2,977 who died.
It's difficult to find some peace and some quiet time to celebrate my son. I think that everybody wants to remember 9/11, but we need to have our privacy too.
At the White House, President Obama and the First Lady observed a moment of silence at 8:45 before attending an observance ceremony at the Pentagon. In Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where Flight 93 went down, lanterns were placed along the memorial for the 40 passengers and crew members who died. Back in Lower Manhattan, the new multi-billion-dollar One World Trade Center stands tall.
The progress and the momentum at One World Trade Center and the entire World Trade Center site is a testimony to the region's resilience and resurgence.
There's positive news for the thousands of rescue workers and people living near Ground Zero. Based on new evidence, the federal government announced about 50 new cancers will be covered by the $2.77 billion settlement fund set up for victim compensation.
The first responders who were there for us, we're now going to be there for them. And we're going to compensate them. We're going to help provide treatment.
Now, as I mentioned before, the commemoration doesn't end with the ceremony. The tribute in lights, which is meant to beam up to the victims in the sky from Lower Manhattan, will be re-illuminated tonight and extinguished at dawn Wednesday morning, not to be lit again until next September. That's the latest here in Lower Manhattan. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Sam. Now, Fast One News reporter Natalie Patterson, she spoke with mourners at Ground Zero today, and for them, even obviously 11 years later, the pain, it is just beneath the surface.
They came carrying photos, flags, and flowers. Thousands of people who lost loved ones on another Tuesday morning 11 years ago.
I come here every year to put my flowers because where else am I going to put my flowers?
Tanya Garcia lost her 21-year-old sister Marlene on that fateful day. She, like many others, feels especially connected to her sister at Ground Zero.
When I get to her name on the stone, that's when I feel it.
Garcia says what does bring her strength is the feeling of togetherness and understanding that comes with returning to the site on the anniversary.
I'm sharing this with so many other people.
People like Larry Meltzer, whose brother Stuart worked for Cantor Fitzgerald in the North Tower.
He was just a terrific guy, a fun-loving guy.
Stuart Meltzer left behind his wife and 2 young children. Larry says following 9/11, he's tried to share as much as he can with the kids to keep their father's memory alive.
I spent a lot of time with him, trying to tell him a little bit about who their dad was and actually spending time with him, telling him funny stories, ridiculous things that we did when we were growing up.
Jean Carey's husband was one of countless FDNY firefighters who responded to the scene. She says her support has come from her immediate family, but also her extended family.
Oh, my life has been still filled with the fire department. There is a camaraderie there. You know, we all raised our children together. He was on the job 20 years when he passed.
For 11 years, Jean has returned to Ground Zero, each time wearing her husband's FDNY shirt. She says she takes time to honor the memory of all the responders who made the ultimate sacrifice on 9/11.
My husband's firehouse, Hazmat 1 in Squad 288, we had the largest loss in the city, 19.
The loss, of course, doesn't get any easier as time passes, but each person we spoke to said there is always a feeling of closeness and peace that comes with revisiting the site. In Lower Manhattan, Natalie Patterson, FiOS 1 News.
Obviously a tough day for a lot of those folks, and certainly brings up every year at this time, I think for not just New Yorkers, but everybody across the country, the memories of where we were 11 years ago to the day. Now, beyond just the memorials and the remembrances, there are open questions, including the 9/11 Museum. It was slated to open this month, but political squabbling has kept that from happening. But the completion of the museum finally appears to be back on track after Governors Cuomo and Christie, along with Mayor Bloomberg, who didn't see eye to eye on this, came to an agreement late Monday. Construction, it stopped about a year ago after a funding fight between the Port Authority and the foundations that control the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. New agreement specifies that no additional public funding will be used to complete the project. Construction on the museum, it reportedly will resume at the end of this month. And as for the new One World Trade Center, also known as the Freedom Tower, it's scheduled to be completed in 2014. Upon completion, it'll be the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. Now, as we've talked about, the anniversary of 9/11 was remembered more quietly this year than last.
We did the same thing for 10 years. It's time to do something different.
For the first time, no elected officials spoke at Ground Zero. Instead of big-name musicians, a youth chorus provided the music, and across the river in New Jersey, at least 2 communities decided against holding their own annual memorial programs this year. The National Cathedral in Washington held a 3-day commemoration last year. This year, it was just prayers during regularly scheduled services. The interim dean of the cathedral put it the following way as to the rationale, quote, "I think it's fair to say that 11 years later, we all felt that it was important still to commemorate it, but to do so in perhaps a less overt, less somber way, to do so maturely and to look forward." An editorial writer for the Dallas Morning News went so far as to say, quote, "No one means to disrespect those who died or the families who suffered as a result of the attacks, but the fact that we were attacked on 9/11 does not mean that we must now be a nation perpetually in mourning on this date. It really is time to move on." The writer pointed out that today's front cover of the New York Times didn't bear a single mention of 9/11. At the 11-year mark, the pain obviously still there, but perhaps it is less fresh to many that have not lost loved ones. So many ask how 9/11 ought to be commemorated from this point forward. And last year, Mayor Bloomberg even suggested that future ceremonies not include the readings of the victims' names. Obviously, that didn't take place today as all names were read. I want to bring in our panel on this. Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. T.J. McCormack, conservative radio talk show host, and our senior political correspondent, Andrew Whitman. Listen, we know behind the scenes there was a fight between Governors Christie, Dominic, and Governor Cuomo who wanted to be there to say something. And conversely, Mayor Bloomberg said no politicians speaking at all. There is not unanimity here when it relates to public officials, and I think to a lot of people what to do going forward. And I don't think anybody wants to go out and say, other than that editorial writer, let's just put it in the rearview mirror. It's a tough balance here, isn't it?
I couldn't agree with you more, Richard. It's one that's very delicate, something that stands out in our nation's history, will always stand out in our nation's history. Mayor Bloomberg has wanted to move on for a while, and he's taken criticism. He tried to do this, what happened today, a few years ago, but the outcry was so large from the families that he had to pull back and concede and give in. Some may feel that it is time to move on, but perhaps I'm in the minority. I feel that especially the pain of the families, that there should always be something very special on this day.
And you know, I know, obviously, T.J., that in Washington, the president, in fact, was at the Pentagon today, where obviously they lost life on the fields in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. There's a memorial now that's in place. But while it was a nation's wound, if you live in New York, you either know somebody or you know somebody who knows somebody that was in the towers that either got out or unfortunately didn't. I don't see a year from today, and by the way, this is something the TV networks struggle with and the affiliates in New York, how to do this, right?
Sure.
That it's just going to be another day with a moment of silence. I don't see that changing as much as maybe some folks would like it to.
I just got off the phone, literally, in the parking lot here at the studios with a friend of mine who was driving up from Philadelphia, who was going through a bit of an emotional moment where he was saying that he had a real resentment against the country because down in Philly there was nary a word about it amongst people. I spent a good amount of time in Los Angeles before I moved back here, and one of the last couple of years before I moved, I have one of those flags, the flag of honor, where the stars and stripes made up of the names of the victims. And I put it on my picket fence, and I had neighbors come up and looking at it, and they asked me what it was, and I said, "Oh, these are the victims." And they literally, the victims of what? So there is a slight disconnect the further we go on, and I think it's personal, it's individual. I think you're totally okay and justified to carry everything from pain and anger. Today, I watched the coverage and of all the highlights, all of the footage from that day. And every year I find myself getting a whole lot angrier by lunchtime than I had been the night before at our enemies, at the people that did it. So I think it's so deeply personal. I'm sorry I'm giving you a long answer,
but
it's a tough.
It is personal, but Andrew, cities, states. They have to figure out how to do it. And we look at the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. There's a moment of silence there. And it wasn't of the scope, certainly, that we saw on 9/11. But it nonetheless, obviously, is a permanent scar on that city. What is the right answer?
Well, and there are still memorials every year on December 7th, though I'm sure a number of people in the audience probably don't know the significance of that day. It's Pearl Harbor Day. These things will continue. I'm sure that New York will always continue to remember.
5 years from now, are we doing the same thing,
I think there will be something. I don't know if it'll be the same thing, but it's also, to have all the politicians come down, it's always an election year somewhere.
I found myself not missing them at all.
Didn't miss them at all.
I don't think anybody missed them, but something small, something appropriate, something for the families, something to make sure that the public remembers the day. But I don't think we have to, I don't think it has to be like the kind of thing we saw last year.
Yeah.
With
you'll see it on the big double, the 10th, the 20th, the 15th, those type anniversaries.
I'm saying the 12th and the 13th year, if New York and the mayor, whoever it is, tries to say, okay, let's just have a moment of silence. The outcry, I think they'll underestimate how many people will say, not so fast, you can't just put this in the rearview mirror. All right, keep this conversation going online, please, folks. Go to our Facebook page or Twitter to sound off on our question tonight. How should we commemorate 9/11 going forward? And we're going to come back later in the show and get to some of those comments, so if you haven't posted them, please do so. When we come back, we will shift our attention, obviously, to politics this election year. The candidates, they may have taken a day off from campaigning in honor of 9/11, but the news didn't stop. We got a surprising latest poll numbers that show Obama not just ahead, but ahead and starting to separate himself for the first time. America Votes coming up next. Stay with us.